Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to talk about a new term that I call subconscious volatility. Right now, subconscious volatility is just a term that I made up. Right, so it's a term I made up to just talk about to just help myself think about what's going on with my own subconscious mind and the one I observe in others. We're not going to really talk about anything new in terms of theory. We're basically just going to set up a definition and kind of start thinking of the subconscious mind in terms of this definition. So it's just a helpful way of talking about the things we've already spoken about. So, to go over this first point, states that positive memory exerts influence on the subconscious that causes it to try to enter an excited state. So basically, that's pretty much what we've already said before. So when the subconscious memory becomes more charged or becomes more and more positive, right? That positive memory is going to exert influence on your subconscious mind to try to get it to revert to the state that is to revert to the state or the experience that's stored in that subconscious memory, right? Which we've been calling an association. So, and I guess I could explain it more, but I think we've kind of talked about this a lot already, right? So a subconscious memory contains an association or some past experience. When you focus on a subject associated with that positive memory, the positive memory becomes accessed, and your subconscious tries to revert to the state it was in when you were having the experience. If that state was if your subconscious was in an excited state, or your conscious mind was in a transcendental state of awareness, then the subconscious will try to revert back to that excited state, so that you can be back in the transcendental state of awareness, right? So that's stored in the positive memory. Now, when a positive memory is in an active state, right, which means you're actually focused on the subject associated with the positive memory, that effect of the subconscious positive memory will be very, very strong, or it'll be the strongest. But even when you're not focused on the subject, if that positive memory still has charge, it's going to still influence or exert influence on your subconscious in its passive state, right? So that's very important. So positive memory, like I said, it's trying to push your subconscious mind to go back to its excited state, both when it's in an active state and even when it's in a ground state. So, just to go to this next point, the more positive the memory, which just means the more charged, the more energy or charge the subconscious memory contains, but the more positive memory, the more intense the influence. But the transcendental state will still always be intermittent. So that's important too. Again, really nothing new. So we talked about in chapter 8 that transcendental states are intermittent. You can only stay in them for a few seconds, and then your conscious mind goes back to a normal state of awareness. And in terms of what's going on with the subconscious, we would say that your subconscious can only stay in an excited state for a few seconds. If it's going into excited state based on your conscious mind. Technically, it can go into excited state for other reasons, like when you go to sleep, right? And your subconscious just stops charging the ground state. So it's a little bit different. But if your subconscious is entering an excited state because you're holding an intention for like 7 to 10 seconds, then yeah, it's only going to be able to stay in an excited state for a few seconds. However, what I want to start talking about is the influence, the intensity of how much your subconscious wants to go back to an excited state, right? Now, in theory, you might say, well, if your subconscious can only stay in a transcendental state, or if your subconscious can only stay in an excited state for a few seconds, then how do you not lose everything that you've charged after a few seconds? Well, the reason has to do with the effect of passive memory, right? So if you charge your subconscious, relative to some subject, right? So some positive memory is becoming more positive. When you go in a transcendental state, you will experience the effects of your subconscious being in a excited state, or you'll be able to use your transcendental mental abilities most powerfully. But when your subconscious goes back to its ground state, the subconscious memories is still influencing your subconscious in its passive state. So technically, when your subconscious goes back to its ground state, it doesn't actually the activity of your subconscious doesn't completely or fully reflect ground state properties. So that's how that's how you actually maintain the charge and how it influences you continuously. So even in your ground state, technically you would still be able to express or experience subconscious activity that's related to its excited state. So for example, when your positive memory is in a passive state, we're talking about your mood, right? So even when your subconscious goes back to its ground state, it's not like your mood suddenly goes away. You still have a mood. You still feel something. So you still feel emotion, right? Or you still may feel an urge or compulsion to believe something or do something or create in some way, right? Even though your subconscious is still in its ground state, you still have an ambient, a kind of ambient urge or compulsion representing your transcendental mental abilities, which we've normally been attributing to excited state. So technically in this ground state, this doesn't fully reflect ground state properties as a result of passive memory. So that's why your subconscious charge doesn't just go away when your subconscious goes back to its ground state. However, we're not really it's a little bit too much to get into the weeds to talk about a ground state that reflects when you don't have a lot of charge or a lot of positive memory, which then, yeah, it's just going to reflect the ground state properties and normal state of awareness and normal mental abilities that we've been talking about. It gets into the weeds to talk about that versus a ground state where there is a lot of passive memory and there is still an ambient sort of, there are ambient compulsions representing your transcendental mental abilities. It's too much to talk about. So I just say your subconscious goes back to its ground state, and then depending on the context, we'll recognize if there's a lot of positive memory attributing to your mood and still influencing your subconscious in this ground state to have excited state properties. But what I really want to talk about here is this idea of how intense that positive memory is trying to get your subconscious to go back to its excited state. And that's kind of a little bit what this graph here is for. So this graph basically represents, this side of it represents the intensity of the force, right? The intensity of the force of influence, the intensity that the positive memory is exerting on the subconscious to enter an excited state, and this part of the graph represents time. So at the very beginning of a charge, right? So let's say in your subconscious short-term memory, there's really no positive memory much at all, right? So your subconscious is just in its ground state very easily. There's not much of a mood, right? You don't have much of a mood, and you're just reflecting a very general description of what we would call a normal state of awareness. So you focus on some subject and you charge your subconscious a little bit, right? You enter transcendental state. Now, when you enter transcendental state, in a sense, your subconscious is going to enter transcendental state and you're going to experience let's just use an emotion in terms of your transcendental mental abilities. Of course, all of them are affected and all of them will be impacted, but we're just going to look at emotion. So when you enter transcendental state, you're going to feel emotion this intensely, right? And then you'll go back to a normal state of awareness where you feel it less intensely. Now, as you charge your subconscious more, so some positive memory is becoming more positive, and you enter a transcendental state, you'll feel it more strongly, right? And then as it goes back to a ground state and you charge it more, you'll feel it even more powerfully and more. And so basically what I'm getting at here is when your subconscious enters, the more you charge, right, your subconscious is experiencing a force that almost knocks it further into an excited state or makes it more excited. It's like throwing something into the air further and further and further, right? So it's like when it goes back to its ground state, it bounces up further, and then when it goes back to its ground state, it bounces up further, and each time it goes deeper into excited state, your emotion will get stronger and stronger and stronger and more intense, right? And then as you start to lose your charge, each time you go back to an excited state, it'll become less intense and less intense. And that represents when your subconscious is discharging or when subconscious entropy is happening, right? So for example, if you listen to a new song, right, every time you enter a transcendental state, it gets more and more intense, right? And then as the song starts to become old, due to subconscious entropy, you start to feel less and less intensity each time you enter a transcendental state. However, we can kind of look at this graph and kind of have a sense that something is trying to push your subconscious into the air or into the excited state more and more and more powerfully, right? Now, the basic experience of when this force is trying to push your subconscious more and more and more is almost like a feeling of antsiness, right? And it's something I call subconscious volatility. So it's helpful to think in the terms of your subconscious in that term. And just to go over this next point, it says that, oh, I forgot to mention for this case, right? So, well, I feel like I kind of already went over it. But what I wanted to say was that I like to think of this dynamic, right? So no matter how charged the positive or subconscious memory becomes, or no matter how positive it becomes, your subconscious will always still favor a ground state. So you can only stay in it for a couple seconds, no matter how much charged it is. And what I like to think of that dynamic as, what I like to compare it to, is the stability of matter, right? So an atom, right, in its nucleus contains protons, right? So it contains neutrons too, but neutrons don't have a charge. So it contains protons, and those protons have a positive charge. So those protons are constantly trying to, like charges basically repel, right? So those protons are constantly trying to repel each other because they have the same charge. But they're stuffed in an extremely small space where the repulsion force should be extraordinarily powerful. So how are they still together? Well, it's because they have another force called strong force that holds them together. So strong force is even more powerful than the electromagnetic force that's pushing them apart. So that's how matter is stable. So your subconscious mind kind of does something similar. I believe it's coming from your body, but your body exerts a force, or something's exerting a force on your subconscious mind that makes it go back to a ground state after only a few seconds. So as far as I know, no matter how powerful a subconscious charge is, or how powerful a positive memory becomes, it can only stay in an excited state it can only keep your mind your subconscious in its excited state for a few seconds, right? Or it can only allow your conscious mind to enter a transcendental state for a few seconds. So as far as I've never experienced the ability to stay in that state longer than a few seconds by holding an attention. So I just wanted to mention that. So your subconscious will always go back to its ground state. However, your passive memory will sort of maintain the effects of your charge when your subconscious is in its ground state. And then those effects become most intense when your subconscious goes back to an excited state. And you're going to notice that when we start talking about charging in the next chapter, and you get used to it, you're going to notice that phenomenon. But going back to this, just to read this point, it says that subconscious volatility refers to how strong your subconscious mind's affinity for entering a transcendental state is. Now, basically the reason I like to talk about these subconscious minds in terms of subconscious volatility is because this translates into an experience, right? So remember what I said, a state of awareness is really just a term that refers to subconscious activity, what your subconscious is doing. And when subconscious volatility goes up, you can kind of feel it. It feels almost like a kind of antsiness. And that's kind of where this graph comes from. So just to go back to the example, right? So let's go back to the example of the chick, right? So let's say you have a crush on a girl. So she's the subject. And the subconscious memory associated with her is highly charged. So it's very, very positive. So it contains a lot of energy, right? So let's say I'm not doing much of anything. Let's say I have a crush on a girl in school. I'm not doing much of anything. She walks in the room. What happens? I go back into my lovey-dovey mode, and I can't stop thinking about her, and I think she's so amazing, and I feel all these emotions. Basically, if I focus on, let's say I'm in school, and I focus on, I don't know, the window outside. My subconscious doesn't do much of anything when I focus on that point, right? But when she comes in the room, what does my subconscious do? It's like it jumps into an excited state, right? And it starts feeling all these emotions and things like that. In other words, it's very volatile relative to her when I focus on her, or her as a subject, right? So basically, you could think of it almost like a highly reactive substance, right? So if you take certain chemicals, right, let's say they're not very reactive apart, right, but if you put them together, right, they kind of explode, or they do very interesting things. And you know that reactions like that are studied in chemistry. But if you put them together, they start reacting, and a lot of stuff start happening on a chemical level. In other words, they're highly reactive to you. Or you can even take a system that I think they're called chaotic systems. I haven't really studied those types of theories, but if you take something that, let's say you take a system that you touch just a little tiny bit, perturb it a little bit, and then it starts going wild, right? Just from a tiny little touch. It's very unpredictable what it's going to do from a tiny influence. A system that doesn't have that chaotic effect, you can touch or interact with very strongly and only has a little bit of an impact on it. So you can predict it very easily what it's going to do. So your subconscious is kind of like that in the sense that it's very volatile. It does a whole bunch of stuff the moment you start to focus on the subject that has a lot of charge. And that's kind of where this graph comes from. So this graph, technically, it would have been better to graph it in 3 dimensions, but that would have been too much. Because I wanted to graph, this represents the intensity of subconscious activity, or really the subconscious volatility. This represents how active the subconscious mind is becoming. And this represents time, right? And what I also wanted to graph was focus, right? But it would have been 3 dimensions. But let's talk about the girl, right? So let's say that I'm not putting much attention on her. So I'm focused on the window outside. My subconscious doesn't feel much. But the subconscious memory is still highly charged. So I have a mood, right? Then the intensity of subconscious volatility is not 0, but it's still stuck at the lower level because of the effect of passive memory. So in other words, in this case, the experience of this on a conscious level would be while I'm looking outside. I don't feel a lot of that lovey-dovey feeling, but I feel a little bit, right? Because I have a crush on this girl. So I would still feel it a little bit in my mood. Now, as more and more of my attention focused on the girl, the subconscious activity increases. It increases, right? And then until when all of my attention on her, it reaches to a max effect, and my subconscious becomes more volatile, right? So what I mean by that is as my attention draws more to her, my subconscious becomes more antsy, and it starts compelling me more strongly to think about her and fantasize about her and have strong beliefs about what our future could be, or something like that, right? How your subconscious compels you on that frequency. And so the subconscious, another way of saying that is your subconscious is very, very volatile relative to her, right? So it'll become very antsy and make me do a lot of things the more my focus goes on her, and as my focus goes away from her, it starts to decrease in activity, but it doesn't go all the way back to 0. Again, it still has energy. The energy lingers around, and that's experience as my mood. And that mood will compel me to still think about her, right? And if I give in to that urge and think about her, it goes up, the volatility goes up again, and I start thinking about her like crazy and fantasizing and things like that. So again, that process is kind of a feedback loop. Subconscious entropy is the thing that breaks it. Otherwise, it would charge forever. But if I were to, say, do the same process with something that doesn't have a lot of energy, let's say I focus on a car outside, my subconscious wouldn't increase in activity like this. It would actually do something more like this. It would probably start close to 0, and it would do like this, right? So as I focus all of my attention on the car outside, my subconscious wouldn't do very much at all, because the subconscious memory associated with the car has no energy. So it wouldn't do much of anything. So my subconscious behaves in a way that's very easy to predict, or it's not chaotic, or it's not perturbed very much. But when I focus on the girl, even as my attention goes to 100% while focused on her, the activity increases, and the higher the activity, the more my thoughts are racing, the more emotion I'm feeling, the more I feel compelled to fantasize and things like that. And like I said, in a transcendental state, your mind is almost like in a mini dream. And so it has a very intense the urge to kind of fantasize about her, feel all these motions, and for my thoughts to be in motion or race, which we attributed to the effect of positive memory, increases or becomes very, very intense. So again, looking at this another way, you could say relative to the girl, my subconscious is very volatile, right? It does a lot of stuff, or it becomes very highly active as I start to focus on her, as I draw more and more of my attention on her. It's something that doesn't have a charge. As I focus more of my attention on that thing, my subconscious doesn't become highly active. It doesn't start doing a whole bunch of stuff. So it's not very volatile, right? So again, as you get used to charging, this might seem a little abstract. Well, why are we talking about this? It's because we're putting this in a very conscious-minded way, right? But when you start getting used to controlling your subconscious, you're going to start thinking in a subconscious-minded way, right? And that way of thinking, this is useful. You want to know what subjects your subconscious is highly volatile to, because then you're going to recognize, you're going to be able to predict how you're going to respond as you put more of your focus on that type of thing. And like I said, if your subconscious is, if you have a crush on a girl, you know your subconscious is going to be very highly volatile to her. So as soon as she walks in the room, you're going to start to have a whole bunch of feelings and a whole bunch of compulsions and start imagining a whole bunch of things. So you can imagine it's going to be, you can kind of predict how your behavior is going to be because of all that subconscious volatility. Now, in chapter 13, we're going to talk about implicit subject forms, where it's not always easy to put a subject in what we call an explicit form, right? So the girl is an explicit subject form. But it's not always easy to fully recognize on a conscious level what the subject is that contains the subconscious charge, right? And that again, we'll talk more about that in chapter 13. And so it comes a little bit easier on a conscious level just to think in terms of where your subconscious mind is highly volatile, right? And especially when you're charging your subconscious for the performance or transcendental creativity, for example, then you'll be able to recognize where, in terms of an activity, your subconscious is highly volatile to. Or if it's highly, let's say you're holding a conversation, your subconscious could be highly volatile in this type of conversation versus this type of conversation, or highly volatile when talking to this type of person versus when talking to that type of person, right? Like, for example, if you might have a personality type or a type of charge, or if a person's very aggressive toward you, you know exactly what to do when you get in this kind of fight mode zone and you can handle the situation. Or you may know how to talk to girls, right? So if you get in a certain situation, maybe at work with girls, and you get in the zone, you start talking to them and flirting with them in a certain type of way. So your subconscious is highly volatile to these circumstances. Whereas if you get another circumstance, you might, let's say you're just going to the store and you're talking to or you're buying something from a grocer or cashier. Your subconscious is not highly volatile in that situation. It doesn't do much. You're going to have very negative-minded or normal mental abilities in that state. So it's useful to know what circumstances your subconscious is highly volatile to, right? If you have very strong beliefs, let's say in politics, your subconscious is going to be highly volatile toward a conversation in politics, or it's going to be highly volatile to a conversation about religion or spirituality or things like that. So it's useful to kind of recognize where your subconscious is highly volatile, because then you can predict your behavior or what your subconscious is going to do. And that's also useful when you're controlling your subconscious, like I said, for the purpose of performance, because you want to predict or control how it's going to be in those circumstances, how your behavior is going to be and how you're going to be able to perform. So we'll talk more about performance in chapter 13. Just to kind of go over something we're also going to talk about in chapter 13, method acting, right? So method acting is a technique actors use to sort of help themselves perform on stage. And that we're going to talk about all of the subconscious mechanics involved in that. Is that the same technique they use is the technique we're going to talk about for charging your subconscious if you want to perform in a way related to your personality, right? So if you want to just be very confident and walk around as a confident person, talk confident, think confidently, behave confidently, you're kind of trying to affect your charge for the purpose of personality, which is a performance-based charge, right? And that same thing actors do, all the mechanics in that are all exactly the same. We're going to talk about in chapter 13, but what actors are really trying to do is they're trying to make their subconscious very volatile to certain types of circumstances, right? So that when their subconscious has all that volatility, then they go, on whatever stage and start acting. Their subconscious behaves in a way that allows them to use transcendental control, and that allows them to give a very convincing performance. But they need their subconscious to be very volatile in that circumstance, and that's why they engage in method acting. So they behave as the character they're playing pretty much all day. Again, that'll make more sense when we talk about subconscious charging in chapter 13, how to charge for performance. So again, that's pretty much it. So we didn't learn new information, but I just like to think in terms of subconscious volatility, right? I find it useful. And one other thing it's not too important, but this is another way I think about this, is as it relates to the concept of conductance, right, in electrical engineering. So in electronics, generally it's a wire, but something that can, some type of contact you're using for a current, right? Some type of contact you're connecting between two terminals that's supporting a current. It'll have a quality or something. There's going to be some electronic device in the path of the current that you would use as a form of resistance, right? If it's an AC current, you would call it reactance, right? But basically its purpose is to impede current in some way. It slows the current down. As this current goes across it and is slowed down, it interacts with the resistance. If we could call it a resistor, for example, if we're in the direct, if we're talking about direct current, and generally that resistor will absorb heat from the electrons and the friction with the electrons as the electrons move across it, right? But we would talk about the thing that's impeding current by using the term resistance or impedance, again, if it's an AC current. Now, the reverse of resistance, or the inverse of it actually, is called conductance. Conductance just refers to how well a wire, usually it's a wire, but how well a wire conducts electricity. They all conduct it pretty well, but sometimes, depending on the job and how high the current is going to be, you want a wire that has really, 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 really good conductance, because it means that it's not going to not as much heat and energy is going to dissipate as electrons move across it. In other words, it has very, very, very low resistance, right? So, and that can be useful so that your energy costs are more efficient because you're not losing as much energy as the electricity or the electrons travel across the wire, right? It also prevents like overheating and things like that. So conductance can be useful to think about electronics in terms of conductance, right? Or the wire you're using to conduct electricity in terms of conductance rather than just focusing on resistance. They're the same thing, right? You could talk about wires also in terms of just which ones have lower resistance, but it's just useful to think about them in terms of conductance. The higher the conductance of the wire, the better, right? So I like to think of the subconscious mind in terms of subconscious volatility. It's like similar to the concept of conductance and electricity, right? The higher the volatility, the more reactive, the more charged there is, and then you can kind of predict what your subconscious is going to do, or your subconscious behavior in that situation. So yeah, that's pretty much everything, right? So we'll talk a little more about this in the next chapter. In the next video, might be the last video, I might combine the next two sections of the book. We're going to talk about the concept of subject closeness and maybe categories. And if I don't do both, then I'll just make two videos, but I might do both in the next video. All right, but yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.